The guards opened the doors of the great hall at Thornwall, and 600 faces turned to watch Vivian Ashford walk toward the man who was about to destroy her. She knew, not because anyone had warned her, not because she had overheard some whispered conversation behind a curtain. She knew because Aldrich Voss had not looked at her in 11 days, and a man who is about to bind his life to a woman does not avoid her eyes unless he has already decided to cut her loose. 11 days. She had counted them the way a prisoner counts meals. The great hall smelled of cedar smoke and melted candle wax, and the perfume of 400 noble guests who had bathed in scented oils for the occasion. Banners hung from the iron rafters, the deep crimson of the Northern Dominion stitched with silver wolves. Musicians played something solemn and grand from a balcony above the entrance. The kind of music that made people stand straighter and believe they were witnessing history. Vivian walked the center aisle in a gown the color of winter frost. Her hands were clasped in front of her, fingers laced together so tightly that the knuckles had gone white beneath her gloves. No one could see that. The gloves were part of the costume. Everything about today was costume. Her father, Lord Harlan Ashford, stood near the front of the hall with his shoulders pulled back and his chin raised at the angle he always held when he was performing respectability. He had 3 daughters. The first had married a minor lord in the western provinces and produced 2 sons nobody talked about. The second had entered a religious order and vanished into silence. Vivian was the third, and she was the one he had gambled everything on. Not because he loved her most, because she was the one most useful to gamble. The betrothal to Aldrich had been arranged when Vivian was 16. Lord Harlan's debts to the Northern Dominion's treasury had reached a number so large that the only way to settle them was to offer something the crown wanted more than gold: legitimacy. The Ashford bloodline traced back 9 generations to the original ruling family of Thornwall, the family that Aldrich's grandfather had overthrown in a coup so bloody that people still found bone fragments in the castle gardens when they dug deep enough. Aldrich needed an Ashford on his arm, the way a thief needs a receipt. Proof of purchase. Evidence that what he held had been given, not taken. And so Vivian had spent 3 years being prepared. Languages, diplomacy, court etiquette down to the angle at which one inclined one's head to a visiting ambassador versus a domestic duke. She could name every noble family in the Northern Dominion, their alliances, their grudges, their weaknesses. She could read a treaty and find the trap in the 14th clause. She could smile at a man she despised and make him believe she admired him. Her father had built her into a key. Aldrich was supposed to be the lock. She reached the front of the hall and took her position on the raised stone platform where the binding ceremony would take place. The High Chancellor stood between 2 iron braziers, holding the ceremonial cord that would be wrapped around their joined hands. Aldrich stood to the right, dressed in black and silver, his dark hair combed back from a face that carried the kind of sharp, angular authority that made people obey before they understood why. He still was not looking at her. Vivian focused on the brazier closest to her. The coals inside had been arranged in a perfect pyramid. One coal near the base had cracked, and a thin line of orange light pulsed through the fracture like a living vein. She watched it breathe. The High Chancellor began the invocation, words about unity and strength, and the sacred bond between sovereign and consort. Words that had been spoken in this hall for 3 centuries, over hands that sometimes trembled and sometimes did not. Vivian's hands did not tremble, they never did. That was the one thing her father had not needed to teach her. Stillness under pressure was not a skill she had learned. It was scar tissue. The Chancellor reached the moment of declaration, the point where Aldrich was supposed to step forward and speak the binding words. The hall went quiet. Even the musicians stopped. Aldrich stepped forward. He turned to face the assembled court. Not her, the court. The alliance between the Crown and House Ashford, he said, and his voice carried the practiced resonance of a man who had been rehearsing this particular betrayal, no longer serves the strategic interests of the Northern Dominion. The silence that followed was so complete that Vivian could hear the cracked coal in the brazier splitting further, a tiny sound, like a knuckle popping. After consultation with my council, Aldrich continued, "I have determined that a union with House Crane will better secure the economic and military future of this kingdom. Lady Catherine Crane has accepted my offer of partnership, and the formal announcement will be made at tomorrow's court session." He said it the way a man reads a trade agreement. No emotion, no apology, no acknowledgement that the woman standing 3 feet to his left had just been publicly discarded like a ledger entry that no longer balanced. 600 people stared, some at Aldrich, some at Vivian, most at Vivian, because the rejection was the official business, but her reaction was the entertainment. She gave them nothing. She stood on that stone platform with her gloved hands still clasped and her spine still straight, and she looked at the floor. Not in defeat, in inventory. She counted the stones. 14 visible from where she stood. 3 of them cracked. One had a scuff mark from a boot heel that looked, if she tilted her head slightly, like a small bird in flight. The bird stone. She memorized its position. 3rd row, 2nd from the left. She did not know why she memorized it. She did not know why, in the worst moment of her life, her brain decided that the location of a scuffed floor stone was critical information. But it did, and she let it, because her brain had kept her alive this long by finding strange things to hold on to when everything else was falling. Lord Harlan moved first. He crossed the distance between his position and the platform in 4 steps, and he did not go to his daughter. He went to Aldrich. He bowed, low and deliberate, the bow of a man cutting his losses in real time. Then he turned and walked toward the doors without looking back. He did not speak to Vivian. He did not touch her arm. He did not offer a single gesture that might link his name to hers in the memory of anyone watching. She was no longer an asset, and Harlan Ashford did not carry liabilities. The court began to murmur. The sound built like water rising, a low, continuous rush of whispered analysis. Who had known? Who had not? What this meant for the border alliances, whether Lady Catherine's family had been negotiating behind closed doors for weeks or months, whether Vivian would be sent back to her father's estate or cast out entirely. Nobody asked Vivian. Nobody spoke to her at all. A court attendant appeared at her elbow and murmured that her belongings were being packed and would be delivered to the outer courtyard. She nodded. The attendant paused, clearly expecting tears, or fury, or some display that would make a good story in the servants' quarters later. Vivian looked at him with the flat, steady gaze she had perfected over 22 years of being assessed, and found either useful or disposable, and the attendant left without another word. She descended the platform. The crowd parted around her the way water parts around a dropped stone, not out of respect, but out of the instinct to avoid contact with misfortune, as if rejection were a disease that could spread through proximity. She walked back down the center aisle, the same aisle she had walked up minutes earlier, wearing the same dress, holding the same posture, but the meaning of everything had changed. The banners no longer framed a celebration. The music had stopped. The cedar smoke smelled like something burning rather than something warming. Halfway down the aisle, she passed the delegation from the Eastern Sovereignty. She had not paid them much attention when she entered. A diplomatic party of 8, seated in the section reserved for foreign observers. They were led by King Callum Drake, the ruler of the Eastern Sovereignty, a man whose reputation preceded him the way thunder precedes rain. The Wolf of the East, they called him. A conqueror, a strategist, a king who had expanded his territory not through brute force, but through a combination of military precision and an unsettling talent for knowing exactly when his enemies were weakest. He was leaning against a stone pillar near the end of his delegation's row, arms crossed over a dark green coat that bore no insignia or decoration. He was tall enough that the lean looked deliberate rather than lazy, a man choosing to rest against architecture because standing at full height felt like too much effort for a ceremony that no longer required his attention. He was not watching Aldrich. He was not watching the court. He was watching Vivian. She felt his gaze the way one feels a change in air pressure. Something shifted. Something was being measured. She did not look back. She kept walking. Past the delegation, past the rear guard, through the great doors and into the corridor beyond. The corridor was cold and empty, and the sound of her shoes on the stone floor echoed in a way that made her footsteps sound like they belonged to someone following her. She walked until the echoes faded, and the noise of the hall was just a distant hum, and then she stopped. She looked down at her gloved hands, still not shaking. That was the thing about Vivian Ashford. She had been prepared for this moment her entire life. Not this specific betrayal, but this category of betrayal. The kind where someone with power looked at someone without power and decided that the terms had changed, and the person without power was expected to absorb the impact without making a mess. She was extremely good at absorbing impact without making a mess. She reached the outer courtyard 20 minutes later. A single trunk sat on the cobblestones near the gate. It contained everything she owned: 2 changes of clothes, a journal she had kept since she was 14, a set of maps she had drawn herself, detailed renderings of every border crossing in the Northern Dominion, annotated with trade routes and garrison placements and seasonal weather patterns that affected supply lines. The maps were worth more than everything else in the trunk combined. She had made them because knowledge was the only currency no one could confiscate. A stable hand offered to arrange transport. She declined. She picked up the trunk, which was lighter than it should have been for a woman leaving behind an entire life, and walked out through the gate. Behind her, the great hall of Thornwall continued to buzz with the aftermath. Aldrich's advisors were already drafting the formal announcement of his engagement to Catherine Crane. Lord Harlan was composing a letter to his creditors, explaining that his daughter's failure was not his own. The court was rearranging its allegiances with the speed and enthusiasm of people who had never promised loyalty to anyone in particular. And somewhere inside that hall, Callum Drake pushed off from the stone pillar, uncrossed his arms, and said something quiet to the woman standing beside him, an older woman with silver-streaked hair and the same sharp jaw. "Her hands," he said. His mother looked at him. They did not shake. His mother said nothing. She had learned, over 30 years of raising this particular son, that when he noticed something about a person, the noticing was never casual. Vivian walked through the outer gate and onto the road that led away from Thornwall. The sun was setting behind the western ridge, turning the sky the color of a bruise, purple and yellow and fading. She did not look back. She had spent 22 years looking at walls and gates and locked doors, and the faces of people who held keys she needed. She was finished looking back. She did not yet know where she was going. She did not yet know that a man she had barely glanced at was already changing the direction of his plans because of something he had seen in her hands. She only knew that the trunk was light and the road was long, and she was still standing. That was enough. For now, that was enough. 3 days after the Great Hall, Vivian was teaching a 12-year-old boy how to read military supply reports. She had made it as far as the Crossed Antlers, a border inn that sat at the junction of 3 roads leading out of Thornwall's territory. The inn was run by a woman named Dorothy Pennock, who was 53 years old, had arms like a blacksmith, and operated her establishment with the organizational efficiency of a field general. Dorothy had taken one look at Vivian standing in the doorway with a single trunk and a face that carried no expression whatsoever, and had offered her a room in exchange for whatever work she could do. Vivian could do quite a lot of work. Within 6 hours, she had reorganized Dorothy's supply ledger, identified that a grain merchant had been overcharging by 14% for the past 8 months, and drafted a letter so precisely worded that the merchant sent a full refund and a basket of apples by the next morning. Dorothy looked at the refund. She looked at the apples. She looked at Vivian. "You are staying," Dorothy said. It was not a question. So Vivian stayed. She fixed the inn's account system. She taught Dorothy's son, a gangly boy named Oliver, to read beyond the basic letters he had learned from a traveling teacher 2 years prior. She showed him how to break down a written document, find the important numbers, separate the honest claims from the inflated ones. Oliver absorbed it the way dry ground absorbs rain, fast and desperate, and slightly overwhelmed. On the 3rd morning, Vivian was sitting at a table near the kitchen, walking Oliver through a practice exercise involving a fictional supply chain, when the door of the inn opened and a man walked in wearing the uniform of a royal courier. Dark green coat. No insignia except a silver pin on the collar shaped like a wolf's head beneath a crescent moon. The pin was the seal of the Eastern sovereignty. The courier scanned the room, located Vivian, and crossed directly to her table. He did not ask if she was Vivian Ashford. He already knew. He placed a rolled document on the table beside Oliver's practice papers and stepped back. Vivian looked at the document. It was sealed with dark green wax, the wolf and moon pressed into it with the depth and precision that indicated a royal signet ring, not a generic stamp. The seal was unbroken. The parchment was heavy, the kind used for communications between heads of state. She picked it up and turned it over. The address on the outside read, Vivian Ashford, unbonded and sovereign of her own person. She read it twice. Not the contents, the address. Because the address was the message, or at least the first layer of it. Every formal document she had ever received had been addressed to her through a man. Vivian Ashford, daughter of Lord Harlan. Vivian Ashford, betrothed of King Aldrich, always tethered, always belonging to. This one named her as belonging to herself. She broke the seal. The document was a formal petition, not a letter, not an invitation, a petition, drafted in the precise legal language of inter-kingdom diplomacy, the kind of document that required witnesses and counter-signatures and could not be retracted without formal proceedings. King Callum Drake of the Eastern Sovereignty was invoking the right of open claim. Vivian set the document down and stared at it, the way one stares at a door that has appeared in a wall that had no door yesterday. The right of open claim was an ancient law, older than both kingdoms in their current form. It permitted any ruling monarch to formally petition for an alliance with an unbonded noble of another kingdom, provided the petitioning monarch held diplomatic standing in that kingdom. The petition had to be presented before the full court of the kingdom where the unbonded noble resided. It could not be conducted in private. It could not be refused without formal grounds. It was a law that nobody used anymore, because it was, by design, a public spectacle. It forced the host kingdom to open its court, assemble its witnesses, and allow a foreign ruler to stand in its own great hall and make a claim that the host could not easily dismiss without creating a diplomatic crisis. Callum Drake was not just proposing an alliance. He was forcing Aldrich Voss to watch it happen in his own house. Oliver leaned over to look at the document. What does that say? It says that someone is either very brave or very reckless, Vivian said, and I have not yet decided which. She asked the courier one question. Did your king send instructions regarding my response? He said to tell you that no response is required, the courier answered. The petition stands regardless of your attendance. But he said you would attend. Did he? He said you would want to see their faces. Vivian folded the document precisely along its original creases and placed it inside the inner pocket of her coat. She sat very still for a moment, and the only thing that moved was her right thumb, pressing against the edge of the table with a force that left a white mark on the wood. Dorothy appeared from the kitchen, read the room the way she read an incoming storm, and set a cup of tea on the table without being asked. Vivian picked up the tea. It was too hot to drink. She drank it anyway. Oliver was watching her with the wide, uncertain eyes of a boy who understood that something significant had happened but could not yet name what it was. He looked at the courier, who stood at attention near the door. He looked at the document pocket in Vivian's coat. He looked back at Vivian. "Are you leaving?" he asked. She set the tea down. The question landed in a place she had not expected, a soft place, an unguarded corner that she had not realized was exposed until the boy's voice found it. "For a few days," she said. "Are you coming back?" She did not answer immediately. She looked at Oliver, at his ink-stained fingers, and the practice document she had prepared for him, half finished on the table, his careful handwriting filling the margins with notes she had taught him to take. She had known this boy for 3 days. She had taught him more in 3 days than anyone had bothered to teach him in 12 years, because no one had looked at a gangly innkeeper's son and seen someone worth teaching. "I will come back for the reading lessons," she said. Oliver nodded. It was enough for him. Promises about reading lessons were the kind of promises he understood, small and specific and real. Vivian spent the rest of that day preparing. She washed her traveling coat and pressed it dry by the fire. She cleaned her boots. She reviewed the document 3 more times, not because she needed to understand its contents better, but because she wanted to memorize the exact legal phrasing so that when she stood in the Great Hall, she would know every angle of the law that protected her presence there. She was not walking into Thornwall unprepared. Not again. Not ever again. Dorothy provided a horse for the journey, a sturdy brown gelding named Copper, who had the temperament of a piece of furniture and the stamina of something considerably more alive. Vivian rode through the countryside she had walked 3 days earlier, past the same farms and fences and roadside markers, and the landscape looked different from horseback. Higher, wider, less like a place she was escaping from and more like a place she was passing through on her way to somewhere specific. She arrived at Thornwall in the late afternoon of the second day. The outer gate was attended by the same guards who had watched her leave with a single trunk. They recognized her. She could see it in their faces, the quick flicker of surprise and then the careful blankness that guards learn to wear when they do not want to be responsible for having an opinion. She gave Copper to a stable hand and walked through the courtyard toward the Great Hall. The doors were still closed. The ceremony would begin at sundown. She had 2 hours. She spent them in the courtyard, sitting on a stone bench near the fountain, watching people arrive. Noble families in carriages, diplomats on horseback, servants carrying armloads of flowers and candles into the hall, the machinery of a royal event assembling itself around her while she sat in the middle of it, unhurried and unmoved. She was not nervous. She was something else. Something that lived in the space between anticipation and resolve, a coiled readiness that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the knowledge that what was about to happen would change the shape of her life, and she was walking into it with her eyes open. 2 days later, the Great Hall of Thornwall opened its doors for the second time in a week, and the court assembled with the barely suppressed anticipation of people who had been promised another performance. Aldrich sat on his throne. He had no choice. The right of open claim was embedded in the same body of law that legitimized his rule, and refusing to honor it would undermine every legal foundation he had spent years constructing. His advisors had spent 48 hours trying to find a loophole. There was none. The law was clear, and it was clear because it had been written by people who understood that powerful men would always look for ways around it. Catherine Crane sat in the consort's chair to Aldrich's left, a position she had occupied for exactly 3 days. She was a tall woman with dark auburn hair and the composed expression of someone who had grown up watching her family negotiate trade deals worth more than most kingdoms' annual budgets. She was not stupid, and she was not unaware of what today meant. She sat very straight and kept her eyes on the middle distance. The foreign delegations filled the observer galleries. Ambassadors from 6 kingdoms, trade envoys, military attachés, and the full delegation of the Eastern sovereignty, which had remained in Thornwall since the original ceremony. They had not left. That detail, which the court had initially dismissed as diplomatic courtesy, now revealed itself as strategy. Callum had never intended to leave before this moment. The doors opened. Vivian walked in. She was wearing the same coat she had worn at the inn, a simple dark blue traveling coat with brass buttons, the kind of coat that a woman with 1 trunk and no title wears because it is the warmest thing she owns. She had not dressed for the occasion. She had not attempted to match the finery of the court. She walked down the center aisle the way she had walked it 6 days earlier, with the same posture, the same clasped hands, the same absolute refusal to perform for an audience. The difference was that this time, she was not walking toward a man who was about to discard her. She was walking into a room where a different man was about to say something that would change everything. Callum Drake entered from the side gallery. He descended the short staircase to the main floor with an ease that suggested he had spent his life walking into rooms that did not want him and making himself comfortable anyway. He was dressed simply, the same dark green coat with no decoration except the wolf and moon pin. He carried no ceremonial weapon, no crown, no visible symbol of rank beyond the pin. He did not need symbols. He carried authority the way some people carry height, as a fact of his physical presence that required no announcement. He walked to the center of the great hall, stopped 10 feet from the throne platform, and turned to face Vivian. Not Aldrich, not the Chancellor, not the court. Vivian. He spoke without preamble. I am Callum Drake, King of the Eastern Sovereignty by right of succession and consent of the governed. I invoke the right of open claim, as recorded in the Treaty of the Five Crowns, to petition for formal alliance with Vivian Ashford. The court was silent. Aldrich's jaw was tight enough to crack a walnut. Callum continued, still looking at Vivian, still speaking only to her. 3 days ago, I watched a woman stand in this hall and receive the worst public humiliation this court has produced in a generation. I watched her face. I watched her hands. I watched her walk out through 600 people who were waiting for her to break, and she gave them nothing. He paused. I did not come here because I felt sorry for her. I came here because a person who holds that much composure under that much pressure is the most valuable strategic mind in this room, and everyone in this hall was too busy watching her suffer to notice. He reached into his coat and removed a small leather folder. He opened it and held it so the court could see the contents. A list written in his own hand, not by a scribe. Vivian Ashford speaks 3 trade languages. She has a working knowledge of military supply logistics that exceeds that of most serving generals. She identified and documented every major garrison weakness along the Northern Dominion's eastern border before the age of 20, which I know because those documents were among the intelligence my own advisors acquired through diplomatic channels, and it took them 2 months to verify that the analysis was correct. He closed the folder. I am not here to rescue a woman who was rejected. I am here to recruit a strategist who was wasted. He looked at Aldrich for the first time. The look lasted 2 seconds. It said everything it needed to say. Then he looked back at Vivian. I am proposing a partnership, not a rescue. The difference matters, and I believe you know that. The great hall was so quiet that Vivian could hear the banners moving in the draft from the upper windows. Crimson fabric, silver wolves, shifting back and forth with a sound like breathing. She stood in the center of the aisle, 12 feet from a man she had spoken to exactly 0 times before this moment, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not gratitude, not hope. Curiosity. Pure, unguarded, almost reckless curiosity about what would happen next. She stepped forward, 2 steps, close enough to speak without the full hall hearing every word, though every person in every gallery leaned forward trying. And if I say no? Callum looked at her. Up close, his eyes were a dark brown that shifted toward amber in the candlelight. There was no plea in them, no calculation, no charm offensive. He looked at her the way one looks at a chess opponent who has just made an unexpected move, with genuine interest and no agenda beyond the interest itself. Then I came a long way for mediocre wine and excellent embarrassment. She did not smile, but something behind her eyes shifted, rearranged, opened a door she had assumed was welded shut. She turned to face the court. Her gaze swept across the galleries, across the noble families who had watched her humiliation in silence, across her father's empty seat, which he had not bothered to fill, across Catherine Crane's carefully neutral expression, across Aldrich's jaw, which had not relaxed once since Callum started speaking. She looked at the floor, 3rd row, 2nd from the left. The birdstone was still there. She straightened her coat, the one with the brass buttons, and turned back to Callum. I will hear your full terms, she said, in a setting where I have not already been publicly gutted once this week. Callum nodded. Name the place. Your kingdom. I will travel to the Eastern Sovereignty. I will observe for 1 full season. I will retain the right to dissolve any arrangement without consequence or obligation. "Those are my conditions." She delivered the conditions the way her father had taught her to deliver terms in a negotiation, calmly, specifically, with no room for creative interpretation. But she was not using her father's training for her father's purposes anymore. She was using it for her own. Callum agreed to every condition. He did not negotiate. He did not counter. He did not suggest modifications or addendums. He simply said, "Accepted, in full, as stated." That unsettled her more than anything else he had done. Because a man who agrees to everything either has nothing to lose or has already decided that the person across from him is worth more than the terms. She could not yet tell which one Callum was, but she was going to find out. Aldrich spoke for the first time since the proceedings began. The court notes the invocation and the response. The right of open claim has been satisfied according to the Treaty of the Five Crowns. His voice was controlled and even, and revealed nothing except the effort it took to reveal nothing. This session is concluded. The court erupted the moment the formalities ended. Voices, movement, the frantic rustle of people rearranging their loyalties in real time. Aldrich left the hall through the private entrance behind the throne. Catherine Crane followed him, and the distance between them as they walked was the kind of distance that fills with cold air. Vivian did not watch them leave. She was already turning toward the side gallery, where Callum's delegation was assembling for departure. The older woman with the silver-streaked hair, the one Vivian had noticed during the first ceremony, approached her. She had the same sharp jaw as Callum and the same dark eyes, but hers carried an additional quality, the specific patience of a woman who had been underestimated so many times that she had stopped keeping count and started keeping score. "I am Margaret Drake," the woman said. "His mother, and I should warn you that he has been insufferable since the first ceremony. He has talked about your hands 4 separate times." Vivian looked at her own hands. "They were steady," Margaret said. "That is apparently the most attractive quality my son has ever witnessed in another human being." Vivian considered this information. "He has strange priorities," she said. "He has excellent priorities," Margaret corrected. "They are simply unusual. You will find that most things about the Eastern sovereignty are like that. Excellent, and unusual, and occasionally maddening." They left Thornwall that evening. 3 carriages, 8 riders, and Vivian's single trunk loaded onto the supply wagon. As the convoy passed through the outer gate, Vivian looked back for the first and last time. The great hall of Thornwall glowed against the evening sky, its windows lit with the amber light of 1,000 candles. It looked beautiful. It looked like a painting of a place where important things happened to important people. She turned forward and did not look back again. Inside her coat pocket, her fingers found a brass button that had come loose from the cuff during the ceremony. She had pulled it free without thinking, a small reflexive gesture during a moment of intensity. She held it now, turning it over between her thumb and forefinger, feeling the ridges of the stamped pattern, the slight roughness where the thread had torn. She did not know why she kept it. She did not throw it away. The road to the Eastern sovereignty stretched ahead of her, long and unfamiliar, and lit by the last light of a day that had started with nothing and ended with something she did not yet have a name for. The Eastern sovereignty was wrong. Not wrong in the way that danger is wrong, or that cruelty is wrong. Wrong in the way that a room full of furniture arranged differently than expected is wrong. Every piece where you do not anticipate it, every angle unfamiliar, every assumption about how a kingdom should function turned 90 degrees from what Vivian had been trained to recognize. She arrived after 4 days of travel. The convoy passed through the eastern mountain range at a crossing called the Watcher's Gap, where the road narrowed to a single lane between 2 cliff faces, and a garrison of 40 soldiers checked every traveler's documents with the unhurried thoroughness of people who had been trained to read more than names and dates. They checked cargo manifests. They asked questions about trade goods, origins, and destinations. They were polite. That was the first wrong thing. Border garrisons in the Northern Dominion were not polite. They were efficient. Politeness implied time and attention implied that the soldiers were not overworked, which implied that the garrison was adequately staffed, which implied that the kingdom's military budget actually reached its outer defenses instead of evaporating into administrative corruption somewhere along the chain. Vivienne filed this observation the way she filed all observations, silently, precisely, and without comment. The capital city of the Eastern Sovereignty was called Ashenmere. It sat in a wide river valley between two ridges of low mountains, and it sprawled in a way that suggested organic growth rather than planned architecture. Streets curved where they wanted to curve. Markets appeared where people had decided to gather, not where a city planner had designated commercial zones. Buildings ranged from stone townhouses with steep roofs to wooden structures with wide porches and colored shutters that looked as though they had been painted by someone who enjoyed painting. The palace was at the center of the city, but it did not tower over it. It sat on a modest hill, 3 stories of gray stone with a green copper roof that had turned the color of moss. No battlements, no watchtowers visible from the approach, just a wide front courtyard with an iron gate that stood open. Open. During daylight hours, the gate to the king's palace stood open. Vivienne made a note of this, and immediately began calculating the security vulnerabilities it implied before stopping herself. She was thinking like an Ashford, like a woman whose survival depended on knowing where the threats were and where the exits led. She had been doing it for so long that the analysis was as automatic as breathing, and almost as constant. Callum escorted her to a suite of rooms on the 2nd floor of the palace's east wing. The rooms were furnished simply: a bed, a desk, a bookshelf stocked with texts on Eastern sovereignty history and law, and a window that overlooked the palace gardens, and beyond them, the river that wound through Ashenmere like a silver thread through green cloth. He showed her the rooms the way a landlord shows a property, pointing out the location of the kitchen, the bathing rooms, the library, and the council chamber. No ceremony, no speeches. He carried her trunk himself, which she noticed because in the Northern Dominion, a king did not carry luggage. A king did not touch objects that servants were meant to touch. "Council meets at dawn," he said, setting the trunk beside the desk. "Your seat is the 4th from the head. If you need anything before then, ask Margaret. She knows where everything is, including several things I wish she did not know about." Then he left. He did not linger. He did not make a speech about how welcome she was. He did not offer reassurance or comfort, or any of the soft, careful words that a man might offer a woman he was trying to impress. He gave her information, access, and space, and then he removed himself from the room. Vivienne sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the door he had closed behind him. She was waiting. She had been waiting since she arrived, since the convoy, since the ceremony in Thornwall. She was waiting for the real version of Callum Drake to appear, the one behind the courteous exterior, the one who needed something from her that he had not yet named. Every man she had ever known operated from behind a surface, and the surface was always designed to delay her discovery of what lay beneath it. Her father's surface had been authority. Beneath it was desperation and the willingness to sell anything, including his daughter, to stay solvent. Aldrich's surface had been power. Beneath it was insecurity so deep that he could not marry a woman who might outthink him. Every man she had known well enough to see clearly had turned out to be smaller than the image he projected. She was waiting for Callum to be smaller too. She waited through the first week. She attended council meetings, sitting in the 4th seat from the head, between a former prisoner of war named Henry Locke, who had lost 3 fingers on his left hand and used the remaining 2 to draw the most precise maps Vivienne had ever seen, and a blind woman named Grace Palmer, whose title was chief cartographer, which Vivienne initially assumed was an ironic appointment until she watched Grace construct a 3-dimensional terrain model from memory, using wooden blocks and string, that was more accurate than any flat map in the Northern Dominion's archives. The council was wrong, in every way a council could be wrong compared to what Vivienne knew. In Aldrich's court, council meetings were performances. Advisors spoke in careful, measured phrases designed to agree with the king without appearing to agree too quickly. Dissent was expressed through implication and coded language. No one ever said, "That is a bad idea." They said, The king's wisdom exceeds my understanding, and let the ambiguity do the work. In Callum's council, people argued. Not carefully, not through implication. They argued the way people argue when they believe their words will be heard, loudly, specifically, and with supporting evidence. Henry Locke once spent 40 minutes explaining why Callum's proposed northern patrol route was, in his words, a masterwork of geographic ignorance, and then produced a hand-drawn elevation map showing exactly where the route crossed terrain that would be impassable during the spring rains. Callum listened to the entire 40 minutes. Then he asked 3 follow-up questions, each more specific than the last. Then he said, "Henry, you are right, and I am wrong. Redraw the route." Vivian watched this exchange the way a person watches a magic trick, with fascination and the absolute certainty that there must be a hidden mechanism she was not seeing. A king who admitted error, a council that spoke freely, a court that operated on the assumption that the best idea should win, regardless of who proposed it. She kept waiting for the trick. During the second week, Callum invited her to review the Eastern Border Defense Plan, not as a courtesy, as a task. He spread the maps across the council table and said, "Henry tells me you drew better border analyses than his own team when you were 19. I want you to find what we are missing." She spent 3 days on the analysis. She found 4 vulnerabilities in the supply chain between the mountain garrisons and the capital. She found a gap in the northern watchtower rotation that left a 6-hour window every 3rd night where the ridge approach was unmonitored. She found that the grain reserves at the eastern garrison were being calculated based on peacetime consumption rates, which would leave the soldiers short within 2 weeks of any sustained engagement. She presented her findings to the council. It took 90 minutes. She used Henry's maps, Grace's terrain models, and her own calculations. She did not soften the language. She did not preface her analysis with qualifications or apologies. She spoke the way she would have spoken if the room contained colleagues rather than strangers. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Henry Locke, who had served the Eastern sovereignty for 22 years and had lost his fingers defending the very border Vivian had just analyzed, leaned back in his chair and said, "Well, that is humiliating." Grace Palmer smiled. Callum said, "Implement the corrections, all of them. Start with the grain reserves." No debate, no modification, no political filtering of her recommendations through the lens of whose ego they might bruise. He took her analysis, accepted it whole, and gave the order to act on it. Vivian returned to her rooms that evening and sat at the desk and did not move for a long time. The brass button from her coat was in her pocket, and she took it out and set it on the desk and looked at it as if it might explain something. She did not know what to do with a man who listened. Listening, in her experience, was a tactic, a way to gather information that would later be used as leverage. Her father listened before he negotiated. Aldrich listened before he decided what to take. Every man she had known treated attention as a tool with an ulterior purpose. Callum listened the way water fills a vessel, completely, without agenda, simply because the space was there. It was, she decided, the most disorienting quality a person could possess. The third week, Margaret found her in the library at midnight, surrounded by trade route documents and empty teacups. "You are not sleeping," Margaret said. It was not a question. "I am working. You are hiding. You are hiding. You are hiding inside work, because work is the room you feel safest in. I recognize it because my son does the same thing." Margaret sat down across from Vivian and moved 2 of the empty cups aside with the easy authority of a woman who had been clearing tables and clearing paths for longer than Vivian had been alive. "You are waiting for him to disappoint you." Vivian said nothing. "He will disappoint you," Margaret continued. "He leaves his boots in doorways. He forgets to eat when he is focused. He has an infuriating habit of being right about people and refusing to explain how he knew. But he will not disappoint you in the way you are bracing for. That version of him does not exist. Everyone has a version they hide. Yes, his hidden version is kinder than the public one, which is the opposite of what you are used to, and that is why you do not trust it." Vivian picked up the brass button from the desk. She turned it between her fingers, feeling the ridges, the worn edges, the slight warmth from her own hand. "How do you know what I am used to?" she asked. "Because I watched your face in Thornwall when you were humiliated before 600 people, and your face showed nothing, and a woman whose face shows nothing in that moment has been practicing for a very long time. You do not practice composure in a household where the hidden version of the people around you is kinder than the public one." Vivian set the button down. "He noticed my hands," she said. "He noticed your hands. That is a strange thing to notice. He noticed that you did not break. He noticed that you had been built to withstand breaking, and he found that more compelling than anything else in the room, which tells you everything about him if you are willing to hear it." Vivian was silent for a long time. "I revised his border defense in 3 days," she said. "It took his own team 2 years to build the original." "I know. He implemented every change I recommended, without alteration." "I know. He is either genuinely intelligent enough to recognize good strategy regardless of its source, or he is performing openness as a long-term manipulation strategy of extraordinary patience." Margaret smiled. It was the smile of a woman who had raised a difficult son and survived to find it amusing. "Those are not your only 2 options," Margaret said. "There is a third one, and it is simpler than both. He trusts your mind because he has seen it work, and trust is not a strategy for him. It is a conclusion." She stood, collected the empty teacups, and walked toward the door. "Stop waiting," Margaret said over her shoulder. "It is exhausting to watch, and I am too old to pretend patience I do not feel." Vivian sat in the library after Margaret left and stared at the trade route documents spread across the table. She did not read them. She stared through them the way a person stares through a window when the view outside is not the point. She was beginning to understand something, and the understanding frightened her more than Aldrich's rejection, more than her father's abandonment, more than the 600 faces in Thornwall. She was beginning to understand that the Eastern sovereignty was not performing kindness. It was practicing it, day after day, in council meetings and border garrisons and open palace gates and midnight conversations over empty teacups. It was practicing it the way soldiers practice formations, consistently, deliberately, and with the understanding that the practice itself was the thing that made it real. And she was beginning to understand that Callum Drake had not come to Thornwall to rescue her, or recruit her, or claim her as a political trophy. He had come because he saw a woman whose abilities had been treated as currency by everyone who had ever held authority over her, and he wanted to see what those abilities would do if they were treated as something else entirely, if they were treated as hers. The 4th week, something happened that broke the waiting. A state dinner, visiting diplomats from a neutral territory, the kind of formal gathering that existed primarily so that kingdoms could assess each other's strength through the proxy of table manners and wine selection. Vivian sat at the council table, between Henry and Grace, wearing a dark blue dress that Margaret had arranged for her and that fit perfectly because Margaret had apparently acquired Vivian's measurements through some method Vivian chose not to investigate. The dinner was proceeding normally. Speeches, toasts, the careful circular conversation of diplomatic small talk where everyone said nothing of substance with great conviction. Then one of the visiting diplomats, a ruddy-faced man named Philip Barlow, who represented a mining consortium in the Central Territories, made a joke. He was on his 4th glass of wine and had reached the stage of confidence where restraint dissolves and the real personality emerges like a creature surfacing from murky water. He leaned toward the diplomat beside him and said, loud enough for the nearest 20 seats to hear, "I see Voss's leftovers found a new plate." The table went silent, not gradually, instantly, the way sound stops when a blade drops. Vivian's hand tightened around her fork. She felt the metal press into her palm, the 4 tines creating 4 points of pressure that she focused on with absolute concentration, because if she focused on the fork, she would not have to focus on the feeling that had just detonated in her chest, a feeling so hot and compressed that it did not have a name, only a temperature. She did not look up. She looked at her plate. There was a garnish of parsley on the edge. 3 leaves. The middle one was slightly wilted. Callum set down his fork. The sound of the fork touching the plate was small and ordinary, and it stopped every remaining conversation at the table the way a gunshot stops birdsong. He looked at Philip Barlow. He did not raise his voice. He did not stand. He leaned forward slightly and said something so quietly that only the seats within arm's reach heard it. Vivian did not hear what he said. She heard the aftermath. Philip Barlow's face drained of color the way a lake drains after a dam breaks, completely and irreversibly. He placed his napkin on the table. He stood. He left the dining hall without a word, and his delegation followed, and by morning they were gone from Ashenmere. After the dinner, Vivian went to her chambers. She closed the door. She locked it. She sat on the floor with her back against the bed, and she took the brass button out of her pocket and held it in both hands and turned it over and over, feeling the ridges, the edges, the thread hole where it had been attached to her coat before it came loose, on the worst day and the best day and the most confusing day of her life. She sat there for a long time. She was not crying. She was recalibrating. She was processing the fact that a man she had known for 4 weeks had responded to her humiliation not with comfort and not with outrage, but with a single, quiet sentence that had removed the source of the humiliation from the room so completely that by morning it would be as if it had never happened. He had not made a scene. He had not raised his voice. He had not turned it into a moment about himself, about his power, about his protection of her. He had simply made it stop. She did not know what he had said to Philip Barlow. She never asked. What he had said was not the point. The point was the fork, the sound of metal on porcelain, the small, deliberate action of a man setting down a utensil with the full weight of his authority behind the gesture. Henry told her later, 2 days later, while they were reviewing patrol schedules in the council chamber. He told her without being asked, because Henry Locke had the blunt directness of a man who believed that important information should not be hoarded. He told Barlow that his mining consortium's operating license in the Eastern Territories was under review, and that the review would be conducted by the same woman Barlow had just insulted, and that he hoped Barlow's paperwork was in order, because she would find any discrepancy that existed. Vivienne put down her pen. He did not threaten him, Henry continued. He gave him information, accurate information, by the way. The consortium's license was genuinely due for renewal, and your council role does include trade oversight authority. Everything he said was true. He simply arranged the truth in a formation that made Barlow understand, with perfect clarity, that he had just insulted the person who held his financial future in her hands. That is the thing about Callum, Henry said, picking up his own pen and returning to his maps. He does not use power as a weapon. He uses accuracy. It is much worse. That was when she stopped waiting, not because she trusted him. Trust was a bridge she was still building, plank by plank, testing each board with her full weight before stepping onto the next. But she stopped waiting for the hidden version. She stopped bracing for the cruelty behind the courtesy. She stopped scanning every kindness for the invoice attached. She stopped, because the evidence had accumulated beyond what her defenses could reasonably deny, and Vivian Ashford, whatever else she was a woman who followed evidence. She looked down at the brass button in her hands. She put it back in her pocket. Then she stood up, unlocked the door, and went to find Margaret, because she had questions about how the Eastern Sovereignty's trade agreements were structured, and for the first time in her life, the questions were not about survival. They were about building. The letter arrived on a morning in late autumn, when the trees along the river in Ashenmere had turned the color of old copper, and the air carried the particular sharpness that precedes the first snow. Vivian was in the council chamber, reviewing a proposal to extend the Eastern Trade Corridor through a mountain pass that had been considered too narrow for commercial traffic, until Grace Palmer produced a terrain model showing that the pass widened significantly after the first 200 yards, a detail that every previous survey had missed because every previous surveyor had turned back before reaching the wider section. Grace had never seen the pass. She had built the model from rock samples, wind pattern data, and interviews with shepherds who had grazed their flocks in the surrounding foothills for 40 years. "The shepherds know the land better than cartographers," Grace had said when Vivian asked how she had gathered such specific information. "Cartographers measure from above, shepherds measure from inside." Vivian was studying the model, tracing the pass route with her fingertip and calculating wagon widths against clearance margins, when a courier entered the chamber and placed a sealed letter on the table. This seal was crimson, silver wolves. The Northern Dominion. She did not open it immediately. She finished her calculation first. The pass could accommodate a standard trade wagon with 4 inches of clearance on each side, which was tight but manageable if the road surface was leveled and the drainage was addressed. She made a note on the margin of the proposal and set her pen down. Then she opened the letter. It was not from Aldrich. It was from his chief advisor, a man named George Whitmore, who had survived 3 changes of royal favor by being useful to whoever sat on the throne and loyal to no one except his own continuity. The letter was addressed to Vivienne directly, which meant that Aldrich had either authorized it or that Whitmore had decided to act on his own judgment, which would mean that the situation in the Northern Dominion had deteriorated to the point where Aldrich's judgment was no longer considered reliable by his own staff. Either way, the letter was a signal. The contents confirmed what Vivienne had suspected for weeks. The alliance with House Crane had collapsed, not gradually, the way political arrangements usually decay, but catastrophically, the way a bridge collapses when the load exceeds the design capacity by a factor the engineers failed to predict. Catherine Crane's family had leveraged their control of the western trade routes to extract concessions from Aldrich that went far beyond the original marriage agreement. They had demanded exclusive tariff rights on 3 major trade corridors, a permanent seat on the Privy Council for Catherine's father, and military protection for Crane family holdings along the southern border, all of which Aldrich had agreed to because he had no leverage and no alternative source of revenue. Then the Crane family had raised their tariffs by 40%. The Northern Dominion's treasury was bleeding. Trade volume through the western routes had dropped by 1/3 as merchants sought alternatives. Military salaries were being paid late. Garrison supplies were being rationed. The civilian population in the border towns, the people who depended on trade traffic for their livelihoods, was beginning to experience shortages of basic goods. Whitmore's letter did not ask for help explicitly. It was too carefully worded for that. But it asked Vivienne to consider the historical bonds between House Ashford and the Northern Dominion, and to reflect on the obligations that blood and birthright impose. It used the word return 4 times. It was, stripped of its diplomatic language, a request for her to come back and fix the mess that Aldrich had created by discarding her. Vivienne read the letter twice. She folded it. She set it on the table beside Grace's terrain model. She sat in the council chamber alone for a long time. The brass button was in her pocket. She took it out and held it the way she always held it, between thumb and forefinger, turning it, feeling the familiar texture. She had carried it every day since Thornwall. It had become a talisman of sorts, not of luck or protection, but of continuity. A small, solid object that connected the woman she had been to the woman she was becoming. Evidence that the same hands that had clasped together in stillness while a king rejected her were the same hands that now drew trade routes and reorganized border defenses and held objects simply because they wanted to hold them, not because someone had told them where to rest. She put the button back. She went to find Callum. He was in the stables, which was where he went when he needed to think, not to ride, to brush the horses. He found the repetitive motion useful, and the horses did not offer opinions, which he sometimes preferred to the vigorous opinions of his council. He was working on a large gray mare named Patience, which was an ironic name for an animal that had bitten 3 stable hands and kicked a fence post hard enough to snap it in half. Vivienne stood in the stable doorway and watched him for a moment before he noticed her. He was working the brush along the mare's flank in long, steady strokes, and his coat was hung on a hook by the door, and his sleeves were rolled to the elbows. He looked like a man who had been doing this for a long time and found it as natural as conversation. "Whitmore wrote to me," she said. Callum did not stop brushing. "I expected he would. The tariff reports from the Western corridors have been ugly for 2 months. You have been tracking the Northern Dominion's trade data." "I track everyone's trade data. It is the most honest source of intelligence available. People lie in letters, numbers lie less." Vivian leaned against the doorframe. "He wants me to come back." "Of course he does. Aldrich's alliance is collapsing, his treasury is failing, and the person best equipped to solve both problems is currently solving mine instead." Callum set the brush on a shelf and turned to face her. "What do you want to do?" There it was again. The question he always asked. Not what should you do? Not what is strategically optimal, what do you want? As if her desire were the relevant variable. As if a woman who had spent her entire life being told what she was for could simply decide, on her own authority, what she was doing next. "I want to help the people in the border towns," she said. "They are civilians. They did not choose Aldrich. They did not choose Catherine Crane. They are experiencing shortages because 2 powerful families made bad decisions, and they deserve better." "Agreed. But I will not go back. I will not return to Thornwall as a supplicant. I will not walk into that hall again as someone who has been summoned." "Also agreed. I want to offer economic relief through the Eastern Sovereignty, directly to the civilian population, not through Aldrich's treasury, not through his military, to the people." Callum was quiet for a moment. The mare shifted her weight and nudged his shoulder with her enormous head, and he steadied her absently with one hand, without looking away from Vivian. "You understand what that would mean," he said. "If we send aid directly to the Northern Dominion's civilian population, bypassing Aldrich's government, we are making a political statement that his government is not competent to care for its own people. Yes, he will view it as an act of aggression. He will view it as humiliation, which it is. But the alternative is watching people go hungry while we wait for his pride to recover, and his pride has never recovered from anything in the entire time I have known him." Callum almost smiled. It was the first time she had seen the expression cross his face, in a way that was not controlled or deliberate. It was involuntary, the way a reflex is involuntary, and he caught it and smoothed it away, but not before she saw it. "Draft the proposal," he said. "Present it to the council. If they approve, we move forward. You could approve it yourself. You are the king." "I could, but this is your strategy, and it should go through the council so that it has the full authority of the Eastern Sovereignty behind it, not just mine. If it is only my decision, it can be dismissed as personal. If it is the council's decision, it is policy." He was right, and she knew he was right, and the fact that he thought this way, that he considered the structural integrity of a decision as carefully as the decision itself, was one of the reasons she had stopped trying to find the hidden version of him. There was no hidden version. There was just this: a man in a stable, with rolled sleeves and horsehair on his shirt, making good decisions and giving credit to the people who deserved it. She drafted the proposal that evening. She presented it to the council the following morning. The debate lasted 3 hours. Henry Locke supported the plan immediately, arguing that economic instability in the Northern Dominion would eventually create refugee pressure on the Eastern Sovereignty's western border, making intervention a matter of self-interest as well as decency. Grace Palmer raised concerns about supply logistics, specifically whether the mountain passes would remain navigable during the winter months. Margaret Drake, who sat on the council in an advisory capacity that no one had formally defined and everyone respected, asked one question: who will administer the relief on the ground? Vivian answered, "I will select the delegation personally. They will report to me, and their mandate will be exclusively civilian. No military resources, no political negotiation, food, medicine, and trade infrastructure support." The council approved the plan, unanimously. 2 days later, Vivian sent a response to George Whitmore. It was written on parchment bearing the wolf and moon seal of the Eastern Sovereignty, which was itself a statement of considerable weight. The letter informed the Northern Dominion that the Eastern Sovereignty would be providing economic relief to the civilian population of the northern border towns. The relief would be administered by a delegation appointed by Vivienne Ashford. The Northern Dominion was welcome to accept the assistance. Refusal would be noted and made public. She signed the letter with her own name. No title, no affiliation, just Vivienne Ashford. Whitmore's response arrived 6 days later. It was 3 words long. Terms are accepted. Aldrich did not write to her. He sent no separate message, no acknowledgement. The silence was as loud as any speech he could have delivered. Vivienne had spent 3 years of her life preparing to be this man's queen, learning his kingdom's laws, memorizing his court's alliances, training herself to be indispensable to his reign, and now the only evidence that he acknowledged her existence was a silence shaped exactly like the space where a response should have been. She did not need his response. She had never needed his response. That was the realization that settled over her during the days after Whitmore's letter arrived. Quiet and final, the way snow settles over a landscape and changes its shape without making a sound. Everything she had done for Aldrich, every skill she had developed, every hour of study and preparation, she had believed it was for him. She had believed she was building herself into the shape his kingdom required. But the skills had never belonged to him. The competence had never been his to use or discard. He had rejected the woman and assumed the abilities went with her, the way a man discards a tool and assumes the work stops. The work had not stopped. The work had followed her, because the work was her, and she was not something that could be left behind in an outer courtyard next to a single trunk. The relief convoys began moving 2 weeks later. Vivienne organized them with the precision of a military operation, which was exactly what they were, except the weapons were grain shipments, and the strategy was kindness deployed with devastating efficiency. Each convoy carried enough supplies for 3 border towns, along with a team of builders who would repair the trade infrastructure, roads, bridges, market shelters that the Northern Dominion's budget cuts had allowed to deteriorate. She sent 13 convoys over the course of the winter. By spring, the border towns had stabilized. Trade volume through the eastern corridors had increased as merchants discovered that the infrastructure improvements made the routes faster and more reliable than the western corridors controlled by House Crane. The economic pressure on the Northern Dominion's treasury began to ease, not because Aldrich had solved the problem, but because Vivienne had solved it for him and everyone knew it. And then, one morning in early spring, Callum asked her to walk with him. They walked along the river path that wound through the gardens behind the palace. The snow was melting. The river was high and fast, carrying the winter runoff down from the mountains, with a sound like continuous applause. The trees were still bare, but the buds had formed, tight green knots that waited for warmth with the patience of things that have done this many times before. They walked in silence for a long time. Callum had the ability to be quiet without making the silence feel like a weight. He walked beside her with his hands in his pockets and his attention on the river, and the silence between them was comfortable in the way that silence is comfortable between people who have worked together long enough to know each other's pace. "Your season is ending," he said. Vivienne had been counting the days. She knew exactly how much time remained on the terms she had set in Thornwall. She had been aware of the approaching deadline for weeks, the way a person is aware of an approaching cliff edge while walking a path that runs parallel to it. "It is," she said. "You are free to leave, as agreed. No consequence, no obligation. I know. Do you know what you want to do?" She stopped walking. The river moved past them, fast and loud and indifferent to the conversation happening on its bank. "I want to stay," she said. She said it without qualification, without conditions, without the careful, specific language of negotiation that she had used in every significant conversation of her life. 3 words, stripped of protection, standing alone on the riverbank like a person who has taken off armor and is waiting to see if the exposure will be survived. Callum stopped walking. He turned to face her. "I want you to stay," he said. the same simplicity, the same exposure. Two people who had spent their lives being strategic, being careful, being 3 moves ahead, standing in the spring mud beside a river and saying the plainest possible version of what they meant. Vivian looked at the river. She looked at the trees. She looked at her hands, steady as they had always been, and she wondered when steadiness had stopped being a defense mechanism and started being something else. Readiness, maybe. The quiet stability of a person who is no longer bracing for impact but preparing to build. "Then I will stay," she said. They stood by the river for a while longer, not touching, not speaking, just standing in the same space and watching the water carry the winter away. The binding ceremony happened 3 weeks later. It was held in the palace garden, not the Great Hall. Vivian had been specific about this. No Great Hall, no 600 witnesses, no banners, no iron braziers, no musicians playing solemn music from a balcony. She had experienced one ceremonial spectacle in a great hall, and it had ended with her walking out past a crowd of strangers who were disappointed that she had not cried for their entertainment. 14 people attended. Henry Locke stood as witness, his 2 remaining fingers holding the ceremonial cord with a grip that was stronger than most people could manage with 10. Grace Palmer sat in the front row and smiled in the direction of sounds she had learned to interpret better than most people interpreted sight. Oliver was there, seated beside Dorothy, who had closed the crossed antlers for 2 days and traveled to Ashenmere with a basket of bread she had baked herself and a look on her face that suggested she would fight anyone who tried to make her cry. She cried anyway, quietly, into a handkerchief she had brought specifically for the purpose. The garden was in full spring bloom. White and purple flowers lined the stone path where Vivian walked, and the air smelled of turned earth and river water and something green and alive. The afternoon light came through the trees at an angle that made the shadows long and the colors deep, and a breeze moved through the garden with just enough force to stir the hems of clothing and the petals of flowers and nothing else. Margaret officiated. She wore a green dress and read the ceremonial words from a book she had clearly memorized decades ago, but chose to hold anyway, because tradition was important, and so was the appearance of effort. Her voice was steady and warm and carried the particular authority of a woman who had raised a king and was now welcoming into her family a woman she had decided, weeks ago, was exactly right. Vivian wrote her own vows. They were 3 sentences long. The first was a promise. The second was a condition. The third was a joke so unexpected and so precisely calibrated to Callum's specific sense of humor that he looked at the ceiling for a moment that lasted slightly too long, and when he looked back down, his eyes were brighter than the river in the spring sun. No one who was present ever repeated the joke. It belonged to the garden and to the 14 people who heard it, and to the 2 people who understood it. Callum's vows were longer. He spoke them without notes, looking at Vivian with the same direct, unguarded attention he had given her in the Great Hall of Thornwall, the same attention he gave to council debates and border maps and everything else he considered important enough to face head-on. He did not make promises about love or devotion or forever, because those were words that other people had used around Vivian as decoration, as packaging for transactions disguised as affection. He made promises about listening, about disagreement, about the right to be angry and the commitment to stay in the room while the anger lasted. He promised to leave his boots out of the doorway, which got a laugh from Margaret. He promised to eat when she told him to eat, which got a laugh from Henry. He promised to never, for any reason, make a decision about her life without asking her first. That one did not get a laugh. That one landed in the garden like a stone dropping into still water, and the ripples moved outward through the 14 people who heard it, and each of them understood, in their own way, why that particular promise mattered more than all the others combined. That evening, Vivian stood on the eastern ramparts of the palace and looked out over Ashenmere. Below her, the first of the spring supply convoys was assembling in the courtyard. Wagons loaded with seed grain and building timber and medical supplies, bound for the Northern Dominion's border towns. Her design, her logistics, her decision. The sun was coming up over the mountains, and the light turned the river gold, and the rooftops amber, and the road that stretched westward toward Thornwall into a thin line of pale dust that disappeared into the distance. She reached into her coat pocket. The brass button was there, as it always was, small, warm from her body heat, familiar in a way that went deeper than habit, down to the level where objects become extensions of memory, where the physical thing carries the weight of every moment it has been present for. She held it for a moment, turning it, feeling the ridges. She did not throw it away. She did not place it in a box or on a shelf, or anywhere that would give it the significance of a relic. She dropped it back into her pocket, where it settled among the other ordinary objects she carried: a folded map of the Eastern Trade Corridor, a stub of pencil, a key to the council chamber. It sat with these things the way any small, familiar object sits with the contents of a pocket, without ceremony, without weight, just another thing she carried because it was hers, and she chose to keep it. Below her, the convoy began to move. Wagons rolling forward one by one, wheels turning on packed earth, drivers calling to their horses, the whole organized machinery of provision and repair setting itself in motion. She watched it move westward, toward the border towns where people she had never met would eat because of decisions she had made, toward a kingdom that had discarded her and now depended on her, a dependency she had not sought and did not enjoy but accepted because the people at the end of the supply chain were not the people who had discarded her. She watched until the last wagon disappeared around the bend in the road. Then she turned from the ramparts and walked back inside. There was a council meeting in an hour. Henry had new intelligence on trade patterns through the southern corridors. Grace was finalizing the Mountain Pass survey. Margaret had opinions about everything, as always, and would express them with the particular combination of sharpness and warmth that made her the most effective political mind in the kingdom and the most exhausting dinner companion. There was work to do. There was always work to do. But the nature of the work had changed. It was no longer survival work. It was no longer the desperate, calculated labor of a woman trying to make herself indispensable so that she would not be discarded. It was the steady, deliberate work of a woman who had been given a place at a table and had chosen, freely and without obligation, to stay. Not because someone needed her there, because she wanted to be there, and the wanting, which she had spent 22 years suppressing, because wanting things was a vulnerability, and vulnerability was a luxury she could not afford. The wanting had turned out to be the thing that changed everything. She walked through the palace corridors, past the library where Margaret had found her at midnight, past the council chamber where she had presented her first border analysis, past the east wing where her rooms overlooked the garden and the river and the mountains beyond. She walked with the same steady, unhurried pace she had always walked with, the pace of a woman who had learned early that rushing revealed need, and need was a weapon others could use against you. But the meaning of the pace had changed. She was not hiding anymore. She was not performing composure. She was simply walking at the speed that felt right, in a place that felt right, toward a room full of people who would listen to what she had to say, because what she had to say was worth listening to. And that, in the end, was the thing that no one in Thornwall had understood. Not her father, who had seen her as currency. Not Aldrich, who had seen her as legitimacy. Not the 600 faces in the great hall, who had watched her walk out and assumed they were witnessing a woman at her lowest point. They had not been watching a woman at her lowest point. They had been watching a woman at her starting point, the moment when everything that had been imposed on her fell away, and the only thing left was what she had built inside herself: the competence, the composure, the relentless, unshakable refusal to be less than she was, no matter what anyone else decided she was for. She had carried those things out of Thornwall in a single trunk, and she had carried them into a kingdom that recognized their worth, and she had built, with those things, a life that no one could discard, because it did not belong to anyone except her. The council chamber door was open. She could hear Henry arguing with Grace about elevation measurements. She could hear Margaret correcting both of them with the serene confidence of a woman who was almost certainly right. She could hear Callum saying nothing, which meant he was listening, which meant the conversation was about to get very interesting for whoever was wrong. Vivian walked through the door and took her seat, fourth from the head, between a man with 2 fingers who drew better maps than anyone alive and a blind woman who saw terrain more clearly than people with perfect vision. She opened her notebook, she uncapped her pen, and she began.